listener production.
A warning. Before we begin this next episode, just be aware this interview includes discussion about child sex abuse. Please listen with care.
He was basically a serving police officer that would go on kids' TV and do little bits and pieces here and there about things like traffic safety or stranger danger and all of that kind of stuff. Unbeknownst to people at the time, he was also very acutely involved in the sexual abuse of young boys throughout Queensland.
Strikeforce Argos was established by the Queensland Police Force to investigate child sexual abuse.
The Queensland government had a need to respond.
It's now a landmark program copied by police organisations around the world.
This Task Force Argos that the FBI go to, the Europol go to, that all of these international police forces go to for support because they are seen as the experts. It's a miraculous turnaround.
Police officers pose as children to lure predators to offend in what is a complex, controversial, and extremely effective method of high-end policing.
Another part of their chat room sting, instead of posing as a young person and basically setting themselves out as bait, they would start to pose as child sexual offenders themselves. Child sexual abusers tended to look for community. They would try and find relationships with other people who shared their sexual interests in young people.
Paul Bleakley is an Australian-born academic in the United States. He's assistant professor in criminal justice at the University of Kentucky's College of Social Work. He's conducted studies on Strikeforce Argos and written a book on investigating child sexual abuse.
Queensland were one of the first to really recognise, I think, the significant potential that the internet had to act as a tool for child sexual abuse offenders. And I think a big part of that was that Task Force Argos was set up at the time that it was.
Paul Bleakley has also done research on what are called Mr. Big operations, controversial investigations that see police pose as criminals to get confessions for heinous crimes.
Every single person typically in this Mr. Big sting is played by a police officer. We're talking about imagining somebody walking into a room where they have no idea that everybody there is a police officer. From the bartender to the three guys you're sitting at the table to the people playing pool, you're completely in essentially a staged situation.
We begin with Paul's research into the history of child sex abuse in Queensland.
This was a time of deep, deep corruption in the Queensland Police Force. If police were covering up the involvement of prominent people in things like the sex industry, drugs, illegal gambling, they were also covering up the involvement of prominent people in child sexual abuse as well.
I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. In this episode of Crime Insiders Detectives, we step outside our usual world of former law enforcement and into the mind of criminologist Paul Bleakley, a researcher who has spent his career unpacking how police investigate child sex crimes. Paul, in your book, Policing Child Sexual Abuse, Failure, Corruption and Reform in Queensland, you provide a historical overview of the evolution of policing child sexual abuse in Queensland from around the 1960s up to and including Task Force Argos, which is around the late 1990s. Could you just give us a bit of a summation of that evolution through the studies that you've done in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, happy to do that. So what's really interesting about the policing of child sexual abuse, or the policing of children really in Queensland, is that Queensland actually started off in the 1960s significantly ahead of any other state in how they dealt with young people. Queensland was one of the first states, in fact, the first state in Australia to set up what they called the Juvenile Aid Bureau. The then commissioner, Frank Bischoff, had travelled across the world. He'd gone on a bit of a junket over in Europe, and he'd seen particularly in the area of West Ham in East London, He had gone there to kind of see how they dealt with their issues that they had with young people, and found that they had a dedicated unit that was there to work with young people, to act as their liaisons, to basically be what we would know today as kind of the friendly face of the police. And so he came back from Europe and he brought that back, and it kind of became his pet project, and he called it the Juvenile Aid Bureau, or the JAB. And that was really revolutionary for policing in Australia at that time. In fact, Frank Bischoff was such a spearhead of this that he was named Queensland Father of the Year, around that era. He handed the JAB off to a man who was really his protege, a guy called Terry Lewis. Terry Lewis might be familiar to some people who are watchers or observers of Queensland policing, because shortly after Frank Bischoff, Terry Lewis soon took over a few years later and became quite notorious for his role with the Fitzgerald inquiry, and then ultimately go into prison for corruption. But before all of that, before he was commissioner, before his involvement in the Fitzgerald inquiry, he was most known for his involvement in setting up the Juvenile Aid Bureau. Now, the Juvenile Aid Bureau was there to basically monitor young people who were perhaps acting in deviant ways, engaging in crime, try and set them on the right path. But it was also there, in another respect, to deal with crimes involving young people. And sexual abuse was one of those crimes that the JAB was responsible for dealing with. At the start, in the 1960s, and I think this is not just something that is limited to Queensland, but certainly occurred all over the world, unfortunately, child sexual abuse, or child abuse in general, just wasn't taken as seriously by the authorities as it is today. We saw rampant child abuse, sexual and otherwise, in institutions, which we know about now because we've seen it come out through a lot of royal commissions and other inquiries. And in many cases, there was still this question about what constituted things like consent, what constituted neglect, what constituted proper parental correction versus abuse. There was a lot of, grey area. And Terry Lewis, for one, in a lot of abuse cases, he just didn't want any part of it. And that was, in many ways, the mantra for the Queensland Police. Even though the Juvenile Aid Bureau was set up and was this revolutionary thing to look after Queensland kids, it also was very standoffish in the way it dealt with abuse cases, very reluctant to pursue them. In fact, statistics show in my research that the majority of abuse cases that ended up being prosecuted or followed through on weren't generated by police at all. They came from other sources like teachers, nurses, doctors, people who would report, suspected cases. Very few actually started off with police investigations at that time and in that era. As time went on, Terry Lewis becomes the police commissioner, and we know, as history has shown us, that this was a time of deep, deep corruption in the Queensland police force. We know this was a time, as I'm sure many people, again, who are familiar with the Queensland Police would know, we had corruption in terms of the sex industry, drugs, illegal casinos, alcohol, all that kind of stuff. But there were also a lot of allegations about corruption in terms of child sexual abuse. The idea was that if police were covering up the involvement of prominent people in things like illegal gambling, drugs, and above-age sex work, they were also covering up the involvement of prominent people in child sexual abuse as well. And there were some really important, iconic cases that sort of served to prove that. And the most iconic, or the most recognizable perhaps, was the case of Constable Dave Moore, who was a serving Queensland police officer that was probably best known not for his role as a police officer, but for his role on the very popular children's television show, Argos Cartoon Connection. He was basically a serving police officer that would go on kids' TV and do little bits and pieces here and there about things like traffic safety or stranger danger and all of that kind of stuff. And unbeknownst to people at the time, Constable Dave was also very acutely involved in the sexual abuse of young boys throughout Queensland, along with a very prominent radio presenter, a guy called Bill Hurry. Ultimately, the both of them were discovered. Their involvement in child sexual abuse was discovered, and it became a very prominent case in the mid-1980s. And a case where, up until the very end, Commissioner Terry Lewis stood by Dave Moore and essentially backed him up right to the final bit. Now, the Dave Moore case ultimately was, symbolic of what was seen as a broader issue in the Queensland Police. that wasn't limited to just police officers who might be involved or in child sexual abuse, and wasn't just limited to this one individual case of Dave Moore, but was broader, was involving perhaps politicians, perhaps members of the judiciary. And there were all of these kind of questions about that. Questions about who was involved in protecting who in terms of child sexual abuse were brought up in the 1980s, especially around the Constable Dave Moore case, but were lost a little bit because shortly thereafter we had the Fitzgerald inquiry, huge media spectacle, a lot of things, quite honestly, a lot of things coming out. Other parts of this story got left behind a little bit. It did come back out again, though, later on. So the Fitzgerald inquiry ends in 1989. There's a lot of fallout to that. Big restructuring to the Queensland Police. Terry Lewis, the commissioner, ultimately goes to jail for official corruption. Many police officers, especially senior police officers, lose their job. And it's not until about 1997 that these reports of corruption involving child sexual abuse come to the surface again. The Courier Mail starts producing a series of articles that are basically alleging that Terry Lewis, at the time of the Fitzgerald inquiry, was keeping what the newspaper reported as dirt files. They said that, unbeknownst to everybody else, that at the time that Terry Lewis's home and office were raided during the Fitzgerald inquiry, at that point, 10 years ago, police had come across a series of files in his safe that alleged that police were protecting or blackmailing prominent people about their involvement in child sexual abuse. Those are huge allegations, obviously, especially coming 10 years after Fitzgerald. Once those allegations are out there in the public, the Queensland government had a need to respond. Because of the Fitzgerald inquiry, we had set up the Criminal Justice Commission, the CJC, which was there to, I guess, act as a permanent safeguard against misconduct, the kind of corruption we'd seen previously. The CJC starts an investigation into whether these claims in the Courier Mail that police were protecting child sexual abuse offenders, were these claims accurate? That investigation ultimately becomes what is known as the Kimmins Inquiry, which starts in 1997, goes from 1997 to 1998. And the Kimmins Inquiry was essentially just like the Fitzgerald Inquiry, was looking at police corruption, but specifically in the area of the protection of pedophilia, the protection of child sexual abuse. So with a very specific remit. And it's out of that Kimmins Inquiry that one of the most significant parts of the evolution of child sexual abuse investigation in Queensland comes, and that's the formation of Task Force Argos. In 1997, between the Courier Mail articles that are alleging that police had for a long time been protecting child sexual abuse offenders, and between the Kimmins Inquiry with, a lot of, I guess, heat being put on the Queensland Police about their actions around investigating child sexual abuse, the Queensland Police had to act. And part of their response to show that they were serious about policing child sexual abuse was to form this task force, which was designed initially, at least at the start, to look at these allegations of historical organised child sexual abuse and determine if there was any merit to those allegations. Over time, the remit of Task Force Argos changed to be looking at child sexual abuse in a more present or current context. And today, they are one of the most prominent investigatory bodies looking at child sexual abuse worldwide. Ultimately, we've come a long way. We've come a long way from a police force that was lambasted in the media, in the public, for being, if not corrupt, then certainly failing in a lot of ways in looking at child sexual abuse cases, to a world leader in looking at child sexual abuse cases and investigating these cases. Even though Queensland's ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, a small state, a small police force, it's Task Force Argos that the FBI go to, the Europol go to, that all of these international police forces go to for support because they are seen as the experts. It's a miraculous turnaround by any estimation.
Paul, it's so interesting, isn't it, to be having this discussion in 2025 where people's view of child sexual abuse is so clear, so concise. We work in environments where there's mandatory reporting in schools for police, for doctors, and all this type of thing. And there can be a tendency to think that it's sort of always been like this. And I'm sure many of our listeners would be quite surprised to hear how sort of laxed the attitude was, and also the judicial support. I've been privileged enough to have detectives in these interviews who were working in New South Wales, West Australia. This is in the 80s, that would say that there was actually no specific criminal offence pertaining to child sexual crime. It was almost treated as like a minor offence. I think it had a maximum imprisonment term of 2 years, which was reflective of juvenile justice terms for when children committed offences. So, as you quite rightly say, that evolution has been quite incredible, and perhaps some of it is because things got so bad in Queensland and things became so corrupt, it got so low that there was only one way to go, and that was up. Listening to your insights, Paul, it's sort of reminiscent of some of the spotlight, I think, put on the Catholic Church here in Australia with regards to their involvement in things. So there's some strong parallels there, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point that you're making, yeah, you're completely right. A lot of this seriousness, or the lack of seriousness with which child sexual abuse cases were taken in Australia throughout that period, was to do with public norms and also the legislation just not keeping up. As you pointed out, in a lot of cases, child sexual abuse offences were seen as misdemeanors, minor offences, and especially if we're talking about a same-sex incident, a lot of child sexual abuse victims were very reluctant to speak up, because in states like Queensland, where being gay was punished by prison time up until 1990, the punishments for actually engaging in a same-sex relationship for these young guys were potentially way worse than for the adults who were sexually abusing them. So for a lot of people, that created a really repressive effect where they were reluctant to report because they themselves didn't want to get into trouble. And we might say, well, yeah, that wouldn't happen and all of this kind of stuff. But history shows that it did. It did often, especially when a prominent person was involved. There was a case that came up in my research about a UQ professor who was found in bed with a teenage boy. He received no jail time. That teenage boy went and did hard labour for 2 years. This is something that actually happened. And those cases, even if they were few and far between, send a message to other people, and especially to victims, that perhaps it's not worth coming out, especially if it's somebody prominent involved or somebody who's well connected. And again, this is where your allusions to how this is similar to the Catholic Church come into it as well. Whenever you're dealing with a giant organisation that has a lot of power, both money-wise, culturally, socially, it becomes very hard for victims to, speak out. For many of the people who spoke and testified before the Royal Commission into institutional abuses in Australia, this was the first time they'd spoken out in 20, 30 years since it had happened, since they were kids. And so many of them, if you read their testimony, talk about how they felt like they couldn't, because they felt, A, that no one would believe them to speak out against people who were so respected in the community, and B, because they felt like they were isolated, or they would be cut off if they kind of rocked the boat too much. Now, that's in terms of the church, and we know that's also true of children who were abused by people who were in positions of power or where there were police involved as well.
And we do see, don't we, sadly, where we talk about abuse of young ones, there is a quite high proportion of male-to-male sexual crime that occurs. And if we go back, as you rightly say, to that time, speaking out about being a victim of that crime, suddenly the tables can be turned that you yourself were engaged in that act, therefore you're criminalised yourself. Also, I think we see a high proportion of these younger folks who are targeted are kids within institutions whose voice is just not heard. I was recently interviewing a woman from the ex-Metropolitan Police officer from the UK. They too have an even more recent record of sweeping some of this stuff under the carpet, which then led to some reforms in legislation and police practices. It's a tragic thing, isn't it, to think that I think, Paul, the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse here, I think it was in New South Wales, could have been nationwide actually. One of the things that jumped off the page at me about that is the average time frame between a young child being sexually abused and then reporting it to the authorities. And as you would know better than most of this stuff goes unreported. When it is reported, the average time frame of over 5,000 who came forward in that Royal Commission was 25 years between the abuse and them feeling strong enough to come forward and speaking out. So that just puts some insight into how long people carry this and the barriers that are in front of them to speaking out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we sometimes fail to recognize is that, as repugnant as we might find child sexual abusers, these are people who are acting in a very strategic way. And part of that strategy is to target young, vulnerable people. If that is having access to people who are vulnerable because they're institutionalized, then that is what a child sexual abuse offender will do. And part of that vulnerability and part of that strategy, I guess, is because the assumption is that if somebody is vulnerable, then they're less likely to have the support structures that they're able to go to seek help. But they're also less likely to feel like they are empowered from the outset. They're less empowered to speak out. They're less empowered to try and, fight back against somebody who is, in most cases, in a position of higher power or authority over them. So, yeah, absolutely. The idea here is that people who are targeted are vulnerable to begin with, and this abuse that they suffer only seems to I guess, intensify that vulnerability, which they then carry with them for many decades. And it has a ripple effect. We often think of, and rightly so, think of the victim of child sexual abuse, but in some ways they're kind of, ground zero for the effects that child sexual abuse have. Imagine carrying with you, the scars of being abused for 20, 30 years and all of the other people that affects around you as well. Your family, as you start to form your family and your interactions and relationships with them, your ability to, function in your professional life, what you're able to do there. That's not to say that everybody who has suffered, child sexual abuse has, serious difficulties in these areas. But oftentimes what we do see is that this has an effect that goes on and touches people who may not even be aware of where the trauma is coming from, but they are on the receiving end of it.
Paul, it's such a wonderful insight of yours, and credit to you for devoting so much of your professional life to putting the spotlight on this and really reminding us that, yeah, things are better now than what they were, but there's always room for improvement moving forward, and we can learn a lot of those lessons by looking back and how dark things were in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in a much better place in policing child sexual abuse in so many ways. We have much more of a cultural awareness of what child sexual abuse looks like, what it is, which sounds silly to say, but as we've seen, that wasn't always the case, that we could even recognize it when we're looking at it. We have far more of an awareness about how it impacts people, about how it should be dealt with, both through the legal system and in other ways as well. So we are in a much, much better place than we were before. But you're absolutely right. There's always ways to improve, especially as technology develops as well. We see so many different pathways that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago, maybe didn't even exist 2 years ago, that people are using to gain access to children who they're able to sexually abuse. And it makes it a bit of a moving target. This is always going to be a moving target where we're always constantly having to, stay alert and stay sort of across all of the potential risks that are involved here, which doesn't make it easy to deal with. And people need to remember that. People need to remember that this is something that is a persistent and pervasive issue in our society.
Paul, you mentioned earlier in our chat Task Force Argos. Now, this was a Queensland-based task force which was established in the late 90s. In the early 2000s, it began to focus on a fast-growing and very disturbing element of child sexual abuse, that being the internet. Can you just put a little bit of a spotlight on Argos and the work that they did in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So Task Force Argos sprung out of that Kimmins inquiry. And the key thing for Task Force Argos and why it got set up in the first place was it was a way for the Queensland Police to really showcase that, hey, we do take this seriously. All of these allegations that we haven't historically, well, if that was true, then it's not anymore because we are putting resources into this. And Task Force Argos started looking at some of these allegations that had come up in the inquiry about historical things, but very quickly that focus shifted. Focus shifted to emerging technologies and particularly the internet. Some of the earliest kinds of activities that Task Force Argos got into online was basically hanging out in online chat rooms. Now, we got to remember, for those of us who maybe weren't online back in the early 2000s, that the internet of back then is very different to the internet of today. There weren't quite as many different pathways for people to communicate. One pathway that people did have to communicate was basically logging in anonymously to online chat rooms where they could connect up with anybody anywhere in the world. Now, that's great. That's a great way to meet people that you wouldn't have otherwise come across. It's also a really great way for people who are looking to do harm to others, in particularly in child sexual abuse cases, to find victims. Because you've got a lot of young people in an unregulated environment who are basically, in some respects, sitting ducks. Now, what Task Force Argos did in that situation was basically adapt the traditional undercover operation and adapt it for the internet age. They were one of the first to do that. Initially, what it would be, a Task Force Argos officer would go into these chat rooms and pretend to be let's say, a teenage girl or a teenage boy. And they would, connect with all these different people online and basically put out the bait. Now, eventually, over time, after they put out the bait, they would start to talk to somebody who was an adult who was trying to groom that person. We didn't even really use the terminology grooming in that era, by the way, but this is something that came up, over that early 2000s period. But they would eventually try to essentially make contact offline with what they believed to be, a teenager, and was actually a Task Force Argos police officer. The tricky part of it was that in the early 2000s, pre-2003, there were no real laws about grooming in Queensland. There were no laws about trying to, solicit somebody over the internet, a child over the internet for sex reasons. That didn't stop Task Force Argos, because what they did was they would use this as essentially a predicate to meet up with this person. This person would show up with the intention of meeting for sex with an underage person. Task Force Argos would then strike. They would then conduct searches, and usually they would find some kind of other evidence that was illegal, whether that be child sexual abuse material, whether it be evidence of other abuse that was occurring. Basically, once they were able to identify a person who was considered an at-risk person because they had tried to meet up with a young person online, they were usually able to find evidence of other offences that were illegal. Now, as the years went on, obviously legislation catches up, and it made it an offence to try and solicit somebody online for sex who was a child. But in the beginning, Task Force Argos didn't let that stop them. They would still go ahead and do that. Another part of their chat room sting that developed over time was, instead of posing as a young person and basically setting themselves out as bait, they would start to pose as child sexual offenders themselves. What they had found through their investigations and their developing expertise in this area was that child sexual abusers tended to look for community, right, with each other. They would try and find relationships with other people who shared their sexual interests in young people. So by them themselves posing as child sexual offenders, they could get in touch with other people online who were actually, looking to do harm to children. In many cases, they would make plans to meet up with them, make plans to, nominally offend together in person. And again, it would be a way for them to create a rapport and create a bond undercover, essentially, with these child sexual abuse offenders, and basically drag them off the internet and drag them into a real life setting where they were then able to, arrest them and do, further investigations on them to find out, how deep this went. So that was the really early days of Task Force Argos's online activities. And, they already were pioneers, and their results spoke for themselves. There was a study in 2004, I believe it was, that was conducted about, how successful Task Force Argos's chat room stings were. And they found that in about 45% of cases, from initial contact with an offender to an arrest, it took about a week or less. So imagine that, meeting somebody who is nominally anonymous online and it taking a week or less in 45% of cases to effect an arrest on that person. In 76% of cases, if we look overall, it took a month or less. What this was showing is that the people that Task Force Argos were connecting with online were very interested in offline offending. These weren't just people who were looking to, have a bit of a chat online and, it never goes anywhere. These were people who were willing to meet up with somebody if given the opportunity. And in 76% of cases, to go from contact to arrest in under a month, in policing terms, that's an amazing result, let alone putting in the X factor of the internet in there, which usually makes things a lot more difficult. So, yeah, from the very start, what Task Force Argos was doing was revolutionary and getting results as well.
I had the pleasure, Paul, a couple of years ago actually, of having a chat with Detective Inspector John Rouse, who ended up heading up Task Force Argos. And of course, this led to a very high-profile takedown of what I think at the time was the biggest child sexual abuse internet ring, call it what you will, in the world. I think over 40,000 active members. They expanded upon this virtual undercover process, did they not, to achieve that?
Operation Artemis was one of the most successful takedowns of a online child sexual abuse community on the dark web we've ever seen. And what that basically was, it was an evolution of the original chat room sting. Remember, Task Force Argos had figured out that you don't just have to pretend to be a child online to lure out child sexual abuse offenders. You could also pretend to be a child sexual abuse offender, and that also seems to lure them like moths to the flame. And what they discovered was when there's these communities with, many thousands of members online, the people who have the best ability to identify who those members are the people who run those communities. They have the most access from the back end of that site. They have the communication with the most members, of anybody else. And so what they had discovered over the course of a few different investigations was that if they were able to gain access to the accounts, essentially, of these website administrators, then that would give them the ability to gain access to the identities, potentially, of a vast array of different people who are putting kids at risk. Remembering that members of these online communities are consuming child sexual abuse material, but they're also producing it, which means that they're also carrying out child sexual abuse in practice as well. So this is not just a passive consumption of child sexual abuse. This is active as well. This is a real sort of significant issue where real children are at constant risk. So with Operation Artemis, it actually emerged from an investigation conducted by the US federal law enforcement. US federal law enforcement had found that the two administrators of a child sexual abuse forum, referred to as Child's Play, were going to meet up in Washington, D.C. One of them was American from Tennessee. Another one was from Canada. So this was the first time they were going to have these two guys who they knew their identities, but this is the first time they were going to have them in the same place at the same time. And they felt like this was the perfect time to launch a trap. So the US federal authorities watch these guys, watch them as they meet, basically stake out their hotel room. Unfortunately, they waited a little too long. So when they went in the next day, they'd found that the night before, while they had been waiting to strike and arrest these two guys, they'd already abused another child. That's how really pervasive, again, this issue is, that even while federal authorities are watching, these two guys are getting together and committing offences. They arrest the two administrators of this website, and one of the first things they do is they elicit from one of them, a guy who went by the username Warhead. They got Warhead's administrative passwords and his login details. Now, the FBI now have these login details to one of the biggest child sexual abuse forums on the internet. You would think, right, that they would be the ones that carry out the investigation. But that's not the case. The FBI are straight on the phone with these details to one of the Task Force Argos operators who, it's the middle of the night for them, and they're sitting in an office in Brisbane and they're taking down these details. And almost immediately, it was essential that they started posting as the administrator of this website. Because any gaps in, sort of continuity, if that administrator was seen to be missing for a certain period of time and then all of a sudden reappeared, people would start to get suspicious and they'd move elsewhere. So it was essential that the minute that they got these details out of these guys, that someone was there to step in and take on this persona. That's something that really needs to get a spotlight put on it too, because we're talking about essentially an undercover operation just like any other one. We're talking about police officers, even though they're behind a screen and they're nominally anonymous, we're talking about them having to really take on the character of a prolific child sexual abuse offender. They have to speak the language. They have to be able to, engage with other child sexual abuse offenders about topics that are really grim, that are really, sort of traumatic and traumatizing. So this is a tough job. This is about as tough as an undercover job can get. And we know that secondary trauma for police officers who are involved in these online investigations, especially ones where they're having to act as if they themselves are child sexual abuse offenders, is huge. Burnout rates are high, post-traumatic stress significant. And this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily realize. It's not as simple as just tapping away at a keyboard. It's really taking on the identity of somebody who is deeply, deeply enmeshed in these abuse communities.
It's just so interesting, isn't it, to just to pick up on one point there that, the FBI, who we look at, don't we, be it rightly or wrongly, through TV, through Netflix, Stan, everything, they're the cream of the crop. And here we are with a couple of FBI agents discovering that they've stumbled upon a what turned out to be a massive child abuse ring, and they're straight on the phone to members of Task Force Argos. It's interesting, isn't it, to show how far policing in this particular area had advanced in Queensland, where not only was Queensland leading the way for Australia, but they ended up actually being world leaders in this space. I don't think that's overplaying the situation, is it?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, Queensland were one of the first to really recognize, I think, the significant potential that the internet had to act as a tool for child sexual abuse offenders. And I think a big part of that was that Task Force Argos was set up at the time that it was. Being set up in 1997, like I said, it took a couple of years before they really switched their attention, as exclusively as they are now towards the online world. But they were also set up at a time when that was all burgeoning. That was all, an emerging issue. And so it was really incumbent on them as a new unit to justify their existence and to learn, to kind of figure out how to develop an expertise and how to deal with abuse crimes in this new terrain. And they, I think sometimes in any institution, it's a lot easier to maneuver a small, powerboat than it is to turn around a giant cruise ship. I think that analogy stands up here. This was a small new unit, not a lot of baggage, not a lot of, kind of history of dealing with things, a certain type of way. And that benefited them greatly because they were able to be more responsive to the reality of the world around them instead of just doing the same thing over and over again. The other reason that the FBI turned to Task Force Argos in this case has, as much as it has to do with their expertise, also has to do with the different laws in the different countries as well. For Task Force Argos to run these undercover operations on child sexual abuse websites, there were some things that they had to do that were not necessarily seen as legal in the United States. For example, as I said before, child sexual abuse offenders are strategic, and they are aware that when they're operating online, that the person they're talking to may be a police officer, especially after all of these years. They know that there's a potential always. And so they put safeguards in place themselves. And one of the safeguards that was in place on Child's Play, this giant child sexual abuse forum, was that to prove that somebody was not a police officer, members had to share child sexual abuse at least once a month. Because their belief was that, and rightly so in most cases, their belief was that a law enforcement officer would not be permitted to do that under the law. They would not be permitted to share child sexual abuse. It's kind of like the thing you see in movies a lot, where they get the undercover cop and they tell them, here, do this line of coke because if you don't do it, then maybe you're undercover. It's the same sort of principle. They're saying share this child sexual abuse and prove that you are yourself. You're not law enforcement. In the FBI, they're absolutely right. That would not have been allowed by the laws, by the standards. In Queensland, however, where Task Force Argos is based, there are laws that govern controlled operations. It is legal for police, when, given oversight by the courts and given permission by the courts, to do illegal things in specific contexts, if there's a specific goal, if there's a really well-articulated need to do so. Now, that gives the Queensland police a very unique ability to perform these undercover operations and to subvert expectations. Because while all of these child sexual abuse offenders online are looking at the FBI rules and saying, yeah, well, the FBI could never get me, maybe they're right. But they're not looking at the rules in Queensland, Australia, and saying, well, could Queensland police get me? In this instance, the answer is yes, they can, under the laws of their own state. And then, of course, Queensland police get the information and they share it with their partners worldwide. And so everybody still benefits. But Queensland police in some ways have to run point because of their very unique legislative climate that they have and their ability to do a little bit more than other people in different law enforcement agencies around the world.
And Paul, we don't need to go into detail of how things specifically have evolved, but of course, we sit here now, 2025, Argos established 97. It's close to 30 years ago. And as you mentioned, this whole area, and with the internet being a very big part of it, it's an evolving target. And I have no doubt that the work that Argos were doing 20 to 30 years ago has also moved and evolved to keep up with that. And it's always so interesting, isn't it, to look back at not only the establishment of a group like Argos, but how it came out of the ashes of the Kimmins inquiry. And so out of so much bad stuff back in the past, we've sort of reached that juncture, and now here we are with Queensland being world leaders in this particular area. It's quite intriguing.
Absolutely. And I think it comes back to this whole idea that sometimes you really do need to take something all the way down to the foundations before you start to build it up again. When the rot is set in as deeply as it was in many cases in the Queensland Police, sometimes the only solution is not to do a patch-up job and, take a few pieces off and replace a few bits and bobs here and there. Sometimes the solution really is to take a very deep look at what the problem is and to rebuild. And that's the way that you form a stronger overall entity. That seems to have been the case with Task Force Argos as well. We are talking about a police force that was under huge amounts of fire, that only 10 years after the Fitzgerald inquiry was again facing another huge public inquiry, this time about child sexual abuse, which is, in my opinion, arguably a far worse thing to be accused of being corrupt and protecting than some of the other things that they had been accused of in Fitzgerald, which were more related to, your traditional vice crimes. So in that context, for such an influential and important task force to be formed that then has continued on for 30 years and has really informed the way that law enforcement does their job, around the world, and more importantly than the way that it's informed the way that law enforcement does its job around the world, just think about the actual kids who have been, kind of rescued from situations of abuse as a result of Task Force Argos. We're not talking in the hundreds, we're not talking in the thousands, we're talking tens, hundreds of thousands of kids who, without the involvement of Task Force Argos in investigations, getting the intelligence needed to then pass on to partners around the world who can take action, who knows what would have happened to them. And that's the real human face of Argos's success here. It's more than, just kind of any applause or any rewards that they can get in other terms. It's those kids who, without their involvement, may have suffered a lot longer and much worse.
Coming up, the Mr. Big operation that lured in Daniel Morcombe's murderer, how it works and why it's so controversial. Paul, December 2003, 13-year-old schoolboy Daniel Morcombe was abducted from a bus stop. This is close to his home in the Sunshine Coast, Queensland. Police arrested and charged Brett Peter Cowan some years later in 2011 with the abduction and murder following what they call a Mr. Big sting operation. This is a very unique style of undercover policing operation. You've done a bit of work on this, some study in this area. Can you have a chat to us about this?
Yeah, so the Mr. Big investigatory technique is actually not too far removed from the technique that Task Force Argos used in Operation Artemis, which we were just talking about not too long ago. So there's a connection there for sure. But essentially what it is in really brief terms, it's this idea that police mount what is essentially an undercover operation. And the target of this undercover operation is somebody who is typically a suspect in some sort of unsolved crime. Now, the undercover operation in this instance is less about police infiltrating an existing criminal organization or anything like that, which is the traditional way it's done. But in this instance, this is about the police in some ways bringing that suspect into a fictional world that they've created. So the initial contact is usually made by one police officer who befriends that suspect and who starts bringing them into their life and to their friendship and professional circles. Now, every single person typically in this Mr. Big organization or this Mr. Big sting is played by a police officer. We're talking about imagining somebody who has no, from the bartender to the three guys you're sitting out at the table to the people playing pool, you're completely in essentially a staged situation. Now, over time, because these are very long-running operations typically, that suspect is brought into what they believe to be a criminal organization, essentially, by these people who are all police officers. Now, they do it in different ways in different places, but, they may ask that suspect to do some small petty crimes, maybe just act as a lookout to start with, maybe take, an envelope from this person to that person. They might stage some performed violence, which is not real violence. It's just stunt work. But to the person who's a suspect who doesn't know any different and they're observing it, then they see it as violence. And they basically create this world where this individual thinks that they're part of this criminal organization or have the ability to become part of it. From there, that's where they start to launch the trap or spring the trap. They start to say, hey, we can make you a lot of money. We can make all your problems go away. We have a lot of power. We have corrupt police in our pockets. We have the ability to make all of your dreams come true. All you have to do is tell us your worst secrets so we can make sure that we can fix them up for you. Now, typically, the people that suspect has been involved with will say, hey, I've got to take you to the big boss, the Mr. Big. And this is really the climax of the operation, where they say, you've got to go to the boss, and the boss you've got to tell the boss everything that you've done or the worst thing you've done. And he's going to ask you a bunch of questions. You've got to be honest with him. Otherwise, you're going to get kicked out of the organization. You're not going to be able to make money. You're not going to be able to have your problems go away. We can fix them all. Everything can go well, but you have to be honest. And that's usually where the trap is sprung. Usually the suspect will walk into a room that's completely wired for video and sound, and they'll sit down in front of what they believe to be a serious organized crime boss and will undergo questioning. They'll have a conversation, and that's where they'll attempt to elicit a confession out of that person about whatever the unsolved crime is that they've been suspected of.
I'm going to refer to a fictional depiction of this. Is quite a good movie in Australia that's been aired more recently called, I think it's called The Stranger, and it focuses on this. And of course, it's a fictional depiction, but I think it does quite a good job of highlighting exactly what you're saying. This is all like almost like a honey trap, and it gets to the crux where the offender is in front of who he thinks is the head of this gang, who just sort of subtly says, look, we've got some police on the inside who are giving us word that they're re-looking at this case. You're the main suspect. We can make this go away, but you've got to be 100% upfront with us. Like, we know you did it. You just need to tell us what you did so we can feed that back to our people. So you could see the trap getting closer and closer and closer. And am I right in saying, Paul, and there's nobody who would know this better than you, that this style of UC operation, I think, started on a case in Canada, and I think that's where it got the moniker Mr. Big, and has since, I think, in Canada and possibly some other Commonwealth countries, this is an inadmissible form of gathering evidence because there's some discussion about it tipping over into entrapment and that type of thing. Where does it currently sit, for example, in Australia in that regard?
So you're absolutely right. So the investigatory technique really took off in Canada, and especially from sort of the early 2000s to the mid 2010s was very popular there. It wasn't until about 2014 it was a case of the Crown versus Hart, where a guy who had admitted to murdering his two children. He said that he had done it. It had been a similar situation to most Mr. Big stings, where he'd been slowly, over time, brought into what he believed to be a criminal operation, and they eventually elicited a confession from him. But what the court in Canada found during the Crown versus Hart was that the admission of evidence based on a Mr. Big case should be considered inadmissible from the get-go. In fact, it should be the prosecution's burden to prove that it's admissible. They should have to be able to prove that the benefits of getting that information outweigh the potential ethical risks of using the technique. So instead of what it was before, which was that the evidence is just considered evidence, just like any other confession, the evidence has now got a very much higher standard for the courts to accept it in Canada than it did before. The reason for that primarily was because the Mr. Big technique is mostly successful statistically against people who are profiled and identified as being vulnerable in some way. It works best against people who are loners, people who are cut off, who are looking for community. That's the reason that they're able to get sucked into this organized crime sort of scene. That's the reason they're willing to suspend disbelief in situations and sort of take up with these random people who have brought them into this fantastical world of crime. It works well for people who are vulnerable. It works well for people, which was the case in the Daniel Morcombe case, for people who are prone to exaggeration and embellishment. It works great for people who are attention seekers, because they're willing to say, yeah, I did that, even if they didn't, if they think it's going to get them credit with a criminal gang. And so the Canadian court saw all of this and put it together and said, all right, we need to be very careful with how this is used. Now, in the Australia situation, the real test for Mr. Big came in the sort of early 2000s, as case of the Crown versus Toffelau. In that case, went through the Victorian courts. There were 4 different individuals who had been targeted by Mr. Big cases, who kind of came together to say, hey, we're going to challenge the legitimacy of this technique. What the argument of the sort of the complainants in the Toffelau case was that Australian law allows for confessions, but it doesn't allow for confessions if a person has been given some sort of incitement or threat, either a police officer or what the law describes as a person of authority. And they said that in these situations of Mr. Big, not only is Mr. Big a police officer, sure, they're undercover, but they're still a police officer, but also for these people, if this is a person who's saying we can control the outcome of courts, we control the outcome of investigations, then that person is seen as, by definition, a person of authority. So their argument was that this was essentially a honey trap. This was coercion. This was not something that would be admissible in court. The Australian courts dismissed that. They said that unless that a suspect knows that a Mr. Big or somebody in an undercover operation is a law enforcement officer or does have some sort of legitimate authority, then it doesn't count. It doesn't count if that person says that they can control the outcome of cases because they're some sort of criminal. That doesn't constitute a person of authority. They said that the suspects have to be aware that person is law enforcement. Now that decision called open season on Mr. Big investigations, because what that does is it says that you can use this technique to get confessions in a way that you would be otherwise really restricted from in a traditional interrogation room. You got rules in a traditional interrogation room. There are things you can and can't do. You have to, alert people that, what they're saying, could be used against them. You have to really, sort of be mindful of, getting them to have a lawyer if they ask for one, all that kind of stuff. That's not the case in a Mr. Big investigation. You're still questioning them. You're just doing so under the auspices of being a crime boss and not a detective. And the Australian court said that that's okay. That's totally fine to do. That's kind of where the Mr. Big investigation technique still stands to this day.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's so many different ways that we can look at this. If we just put the microscope on the Daniel Morcombe case, it led to a full admission. It led to a conviction, not only child sex offender, but a murderer. I was in the job for a few years some time ago. I dipped my toe in a little bit of UC undercover work. And as you would know, Paul, with the knowledge you have, there's always going to be that discussion, be it legal or otherwise, between prosecution and defence pertaining to where does this become entrapment? I mean, you could apply that. You alluded to earlier, you could use that term coercion, entrapment with regards to the Task Force Argos technique. You could use that term if I went into a environment where drugs were being bought and sold. I was an undercover police officer. I brought and sold them. Well, is that entrapment? It's such an interesting position, and it's interesting how some countries have gone one way on it and others have gone the other, because it's possibly a style of policing, undercover policing, which even now is quite sort of goes pretty much unknown to most folks probably listening to a podcast such as this.
And I think that it goes unknown to most folks, largely by design of law enforcement. Law enforcement are incredibly protective of the Mr. Big technique for good reason. They believe, as law enforcement does with a lot of undercover techniques, that to alert the public too much about this technique and let them know that it exists and how it works really puts it at risk. One of the things with the Mr. Big technique, at least in Queensland and certain other states, is that while a lot of undercover operations are considered controlled operations, it's a situation where the officer is essentially being monitored by oversight by within law enforcement, or whether it be the courts, especially if they're committing crimes as part of this undercover operation. The Mr. Big investigation is unique because these officers aren't committing crimes. They may look to the suspect as if they are, but they're not actually, beating anybody up. They're not actually soliciting bribes. These are all actors who are playing roles. So because it's not a controlled operation in a traditional sense, it doesn't require under the law quite as much oversight as a traditional undercover operation would. That changes the game considerably, because without that oversight, we don't know too much about the Mr. Big technique and how it's used. We have no idea because there's not the documentation to follow up like there would be in other cases. We often don't know how much it costs. We don't know how many people are involved. We don't even know how many times it's been used and in which cases. That is, again, something that's really beneficial to law enforcement because it prevents people from becoming too aware of the techniques and tactics. But it also puts a big cloud and question mark over the technique itself. Because I think, as we can all imagine, any technique that law enforcement uses or any institution uses that is intentionally shrouded in secrecy can be misused as well without oversight. So the oversight's a great thing from a strategic and tactical standpoint, but it's not such a great thing from a sort of public scrutiny and oversight standpoint. So it's kind of a very delicate balancing act in Australia.
Such an interesting area to discuss, Paul, and great to be sitting here with you and you being able to put your expertise to the discussion. Paul, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us here today. We're in two completely different time zones. You're joining us from Kentucky there in the US. Paul, yours has been a very interesting journey. A Queensland boy originally, attended Griffith University. You did some postgrad work at the University of New England up there in Armidale in regional New South Wales. Then you found yourself in the US working out of the New Haven University and a recent posting to the University of Kentucky, a massive university there in the States. It's just been such a pleasure to talk to you and to listen to your insights and to see that evolution of policing in this such a serious area of child sexual abuse and putting the spotlight there on Queensland. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the service that you've put into this and that you continue to do in the work that you're doing up there in the States.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks for having us, and especially thanks for putting such a big emphasis on a really important topic, and the people who are doing such great work at investigating it every single day who often don't get recognised the way they should.
My guest was Paul Bleakley, Assistant Professor in Criminal Justice at the University of Kentucky's School of Social Work. Join us next week for another episode of Crime Insiders Forensics. I'm Brent Sanders, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.